The challenges of Japan's isolation in the 19th century. By the early 19th century, the carefully maintained isolation of Japan was facing increasing pressure. Russian ships probed the northern islands, British vessels appeared in Japanese waters, and American whalers occasionally landed on Japanese shores seeking supplies. Each encounter reinforced a troubling reality for Japanese officials. The technological gap between Japan and the Western powers was widening at an alarming rate. Inside the closed nation, cracks were beginning to appear in the Tokugawa system. Economic strains, natural disasters, and peasant uprisings created growing instability. A new generation of samurai scholars had begun studying Dutch learning with increasing urgency, recognizing that Japan's isolation, once its protection, might now be its greatest vulnerability. In the domain of Satsuma in southern Kyushu, the daimyo quietly initiated limited foreign trade with the Ryukyu Kingdom, modern Okinawa, as a backdoor to Chinese goods and information. In northern Hokkaido, the Matsumai domain maintained cautious contact with Russian territories. These frontier regions became conduits for forbidden knowledge about the rapidly changing outside world. In 1823, the shogunate issued an edict commanding coastal authorities to drive away all foreign vessels, the Ninen Naku, or Don't Think Twice order, which authorized coastal defenses to fire on foreign ships without hesitation. But this show of strength masked a growing sense of crisis among Japan's leadership class. When reports reached Edo about the devastating defeat of China in the First Opium War, 1839-1842, many Japanese scholars and officials recognized it as a harbinger of what might await their own nation. China, the great civilization that had inspired much of Japanese culture and governmental structure, had been humiliated by British industrial and military might. The lesson was not lost on perceptive Japanese observers. Among these observers was a scholar named Sakuma Shozan, who penned an influential memorandum arguing that Western technology and Eastern ethics could be combined to strengthen Japan without sacrificing its cultural identity. This formulation, Japanese spirit, Western techniques, would become a guiding philosophy during Japan's later modernization. By the 1840s, a debate had emerged among Japanese intellectuals and officials. One faction advocated maintaining strict isolation, believing that any opening would lead to colonization, as had happened elsewhere in Asia. Another faction argued for controlled engagement with the West to acquire the technology and knowledge needed to defend against Western encroachment. Within the shogunate itself, officials like Egawa Hidetatsu began developing coastal defenses and studying Western military science, anticipating that confrontation with foreign powers was becoming inevitable. In 1842, the shogunate modified its Don't Think Twice order, instructing officials to provide food, water, and fuel to foreign ships in distress before firmly but peacefully sending them away. These internal debates were abruptly interrupted on July 8, 1853, when four massive black-hulled American warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay. The Kurofun Black Ships, as the Japanese called them, were steam-powered vessels of overwhelming technological superiority. Their hulls, painted black with white gun ports, bristled with cannon capable of reducing Japanese coastal defenses to rubble. Perry's arrival, while shocking to many Japanese, was not entirely unexpected by informed officials. American whaling ships had been operating in the Pacific for decades, and the United States had been actively seeking coaling stations and ports of call to support its growing commercial interests in Asia. What made Perry's expedition different was its overwhelming show of force and the clear American determination to end Japan's isolation. When Perry presented a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American ships, the shogunate faced an impossible dilemma. Resistance meant war against a technologically superior foe. Acquiescence meant undermining the policy of isolation that had defined Tokugawa rule for 250 years. After delivering his demands, Perry departed, promising to return the following year with an even larger fleet for Japan's answer. The interim period saw frantic debate within Japan. The shogun, breaking with centuries of tradition, circulated President Fillmore's letter to all daimyo, soliciting their opinions in an unprecedented act that revealed the government's uncertainty. When Perry returned in February 1854 with 8 warships and 1,600 men, the shogunate had made its decision. On March 31, 1854, Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships and establishing a U.S. consulate in Japan. The era of Sakoku was officially over. But this opening was not the simple story of capitulation that it might appear. Behind the scenes, a sophisticated Japanese strategy was emerging, one that sought to learn from the West precisely in order to resist Western domination. Even as the shogunate signed treaties with America and other Western powers, forward-thinking Japanese leaders were already planning how to use this opening to strengthen Japan against future threats. The response of many powerful daimyo and samurai to the opening of Japan was not resignation, but resolve. In domains like Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, leaders began sending young samurai abroad in defiance of still existing travel bans. These students were tasked with learning everything they could about Western technology, military science, economics, and political systems. One of these students, Sakamoto Ryoma, would later write, "Our purpose is not to imitate the foreigners, but to surpass them." This sentiment reflected a growing determination among a new generation of Japanese leaders to master Western knowledge precisely in order to preserve Japanese independence. The internal political crisis triggered by Perry's arrival ultimately led to the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which returned nominal power to the emperor while placing actual authority in the hands of a new leadership class committed to rapid modernization. The slogan of this new government, "Enrich the country, strengthen the military," encapsulated their determination to transform Japan into a modern power capable of standing equal with the Western nations. What followed was one of history's most remarkable national transformations. Within a single generation, Japan evolved from a feudal society into an industrial and military power. By 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. By 1905, it had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, the first modern victory of an Asian power over a European one, which sent shockwaves through the colonial world. But the deeper story here isn't simply Japan's successful modernization after Perry's arrival. It's how Japan's earlier experiences with European expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries shaped its unique response to the Western imperial threat in the 19th century. Unlike other non-Western societies encountering European power for the first time, Japan's leadership class in the 1850s had inherited centuries of institutional memory about European colonial methods. The Tokugawa policy of controlled isolation, while ultimately unsustainable, had bought Japan crucial time and preserved its independence during the height of European colonial expansion. Moreover, the limited window to the West that the Dutch provided through Dejima had allowed Japan to monitor European developments without exposing itself to full colonial pressure. When Japan finally opened, its leaders didn't encounter Western knowledge as something entirely new, but rather as something they had been selectively studying for generations through the filter of Rangaku scholarship. This historical experience gave Japan a strategic advantage that other non-Western nations lacked when confronting Western imperialism. Japan's leaders understood that selective borrowing of Western technology and institutions didn't require wholesale adoption of Western cultural values. They recognized that the apparent strength of Western nations lay not in racial or cultural superiority, as Western imperialists claimed, but in specific technologies, organizational methods, and economic systems that could be studied, adapted, and even improved upon. One striking example of this strategic adaptation comes from the domain of military technology. In the 1850s, Japan lacked both modern weapons and the industrial base to produce them. By the 1880s, Japan was manufacturing state-of-the-art rifles, cannon, and warships in Japanese factories. This rapid military modernization wasn't achieved by simply purchasing Western weapons, but by systematically mastering the underlying technologies and production methods. The same approach characterized Japan's adoption of Western-style government, education, banking, and legal systems during the Meiji period. In each case, Japanese leaders studied multiple Western models, selected elements that served their national goals, adapted them to Japanese conditions, and implemented them with distinctly Japanese characteristics. This selective adaptation reflected lessons learned during the earlier encounters with Portuguese and Spanish merchants, missionaries, and diplomats. The Tokugawa shoguns had recognized that Western power wasn't monolithic. There were differences and rivalries between European nations that could be exploited. The Meiji leaders applied this understanding on a broader scale, playing Western powers against each other to preserve Japanese autonomy while acquiring needed knowledge and technology. The hidden legacy of Japan's secret black ships, those first Portuguese vessels that reached Japanese shores in the 16th century, wasn't just in the firearms and Christianity they brought, but in the strategic education they provided to Japanese leaders about the nature of European expansion. This institutional memory allowed Japan to chart a unique course through the dangerous waters of 19th century imperialism. As American viewers, we often learn about Commodore Perry's opening of Japan as a triumphant moment of American diplomacy that brought a backward, isolated nation into the modern world. The reality is far more complex and speaks to Japanese agency rather than American initiative. Japan wasn't so much opened by Perry as it strategically adjusted to changing global conditions based on centuries of careful observation and planning. When Perry's black ships arrived in Edo Bay, they weren't encountering a naive civilization unaware of the outside world. They were meeting a sophisticated society that had been studying Western power for centuries and had developed complex strategies for engaging with it on their own terms. The Hermit Kingdom was anything but ignorant of global affairs. Its isolation had been a calculated defense against precisely the kind of pressure Perry now represented. In many ways, the story of how Japan responded to Western imperial pressure, both in the 16th century and the 19th century, offers an alternative narrative to the standard Western-centric history of modernization. Rather than seeing non-Western societies as passive recipients of Western influence who must either fully Westernize or remain backward, Japan demonstrated a third path, strategic adaptation that preserved core cultural values while selectively adopting useful external innovations. This approach, maintaining independence through strategic engagement rather than either uncritical embracing or total rejection of outside influence, represents Japan's unique contribution to modern international relations. It's a legacy that continues to shape Japan's distinctive position in the global community today. The samurai who first confronted Portuguese traders on Tanegashima Beach in 1543 could never have imagined the centuries-long struggle their encounter would initiate. But the sophisticated, pragmatic approach they and their successors developed for dealing with foreign influence, learning from outsiders without being dominated by them, ultimately enabled Japan to preserve its independence during an era when most non-Western societies fell under colonial control. As we reflect on this lesser-known chapter of history, we might consider how different the world might look if other societies had been able to follow a similar path of selective modernization on their own terms. Japan's experience suggests that modernization and industrialization needn't have been synonymous with Westernization and cultural subjugation, a lesson with profound implications for our understanding of global history and development. The true legacy of Japan's secret black ships isn't just in the dramatic encounters between East and West that they precipitated, but in the strategic wisdom they helped foster. A wisdom that enabled a small island nation to transform from a feudal society into a modern power while preserving its cultural identity and independence in an age of empire. Thank you for watching this exploration of Japan's secret black ships. If you enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating encounters between East and West, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden historical narratives to light. Until next time, when we'll uncover another overlooked chapter in the complex tapestry of global history.